In this video, we're introducing the toms. Here we have a rack tom or a mounted tom, and this is very similar to the other drums we've seen. It has a shell. This particular shell is made of plies of mahogany and maple. It has a top hoop and a bottom hoop, a top batter head, and a bottom resonant head. Really the main thing that sets this drum apart is this mount right here. This is mounted either on a stand or on the bass drum. Different types of drums mount in different ways. And then the floor tom is basically a bigger version of that with a shell with a bigger depth and a bigger diameter. And then it has three different mounts where you put the legs. Floor toms sometimes can also be mounted on a stand, but generally speaking, they have legs. We're going to briefly talk about tuning with the toms. They all tune in basically the same way, and similar to the snare drum or any other type of drum, you have multiple options for heads, single ply, double ply, heads with muffling already in them, or reinforcement from some sort of dot on the top or bottom of the head. And you also have options for muffling them. So we'll talk very briefly about those, but we went into detail about that in the snare drum tuning video. So if you want more details, head back to the snare drum tuning. This is a brand new head. I've changed out the old one and I've tightened the tension rods to be finger tight so it's ready to be tightened. I'm going to start here at this lug and I'm going to give it one turn, one half turn, go across, skip a lug back counterclockwise, across from that, skip counterclockwise, and at this point I've gotten to every single lug. So now I can start again, or I might start on the opposite side over here and skip. Same thing. You might be able to hear that the tension is coming up on this and it's getting close to where we want it. You might also hear that the glue is cracking. Again, this head, I seated it, there it goes. I seated it a little bit just to make sure it was touching the bearing edge all the way around. Of course, I cleaned the bearing edge before I put it on. But again, we're going to go pretty quickly through this. You just want to tune across each time, and that way you keep the tension generally level. You do want to stretch the head a little bit initially so that it doesn't sag too much once you start playing it. Let's check where the pitch is. We're almost there. Let's check the pitch of the bottom head. So those are pretty close to the same pitch actually. Now I want to make sure that the head is in tune across itself. I'll go quickly. Do-dee-doo-doo-dee-doo. Take it up a touch. Every note that's down. Do-dee-doo-doo-dee-doo. Now let's hear it. It's pretty close. It's still cracking. So it's gonna stretch and move a little bit as you play it. A couple things we want to talk about for sure are the relationships between the two heads. To get the most resonant sound out of a tom, you're going to want to tune the top and bottom head to the same relative tension. That way, the sympathetic resonance that's inside the drum going from head to head will be the same, and it'll give you the most sustain. Now, there are only two other ways really to tune it, and that would be to have the bottom head tighter than the top head, or the bottom head lower, looser than the top head. As I mentioned, this is a rack tom. This particular drum is 12 inches in diameter, and right now we're going to put it in the position of sort of the main tom position, which is kind of right out from the snare drum. And you'll see that this has to be loose to be able to slide onto this arm. You want to avoid bumping into the snare drum because you can actually damage the shell of the drum that way. But you want it in this general position, and then you can use these wing nuts to move the drum around. You can change the tilt and the angle and change the position generally. You should be able to move it up and down both from a mechanism over here or right here if you want to. So with mounted toms, there are a lot of possibilities to move them around. So now I've got my rack tom mounted here and I've got my floor tom in place. I like to have my floor tom pretty close to the same level as my snare drum and just on the other side of my leg. And you can place the legs wherever they fit around the drum set. I like to put the leg that's right here, right in the corner where the pedal meets the bass drum. You want to make sure that your toms are in a place where they're comfortable for you to play them. It might not be exactly the way it was set up when you bought it, but you might want to check out some pictures or videos of some of your favorite drummers and just see where they have it and then try that. You're not going to want to have it at a really far angle, at least to start, or anything like that, or too far away. You want it to be in a place where it's comfortable to just easily move from one tom to the other, whether you have two or more. And speaking of that, the toms should sound like a family. They should sound like they belong together. So tuning will help you achieve that. Tune them in a similar way. Keep the heads similar, top and bottom, between all of them. Even perhaps mute them in a similar way so that they sound like they belong together and one doesn't stand out from being really high-pitched and ringy and the others are all thuddy. Unless that's something you really want and that's what the music calls for, but generally speaking, you want them to sound good as a family together. We talked about some different types of muffling in the snare drum video, but just to refresh, you can use all kinds of different things to muffle your drums, and especially your toms, because they have a tendency to sometimes be a little too resonant. If that's the case, you can put a little gaff tape on the top or bottom head or both, wherever you're getting ring that you don't want. You can use something like moon gels or drum dots or drum tacks. There are all kinds of things on the market. Of course, you can use something like this, which is just a sham. You can use a tea towel or something like that. So without that, this tom sounds like this. It's definitely got some ring. Put it on there. There you get some resonance, but it's not a crazy amount, so if that's where you like it, you can just clip it down. The other thing that is great are these Rootsy Qs, and Remo and the other companies make similar things to this out of plastic that are designed to just mute the drums just a little bit. So again, it sounds like this with the Rootsy Q. So it just changes that pitch. So with that particular one, now you can actually hear more of the bottom head. So if I'm going to use that, I might try to mute up the bottom head a little bit. One way you can test muting is just by using your fingertips. So listen, open, 2 fingertips. So that got rid of that little bit of resonance that I didn't like from the bottom. So you can then put a little bit of gel or a drum tack or something on the bottom to get that same amount of dampening that you would get from just 2 fingers. We're going to reset the kit and bring in the cymbals, and in the next segment of this video, I'll show you how to move around the toms and give you some exercises to start incorporating them into your playing. We're going to play some eighth notes on the toms, but before we do, I want to talk about the notation for the toms. So again, I have a 4-piece kit here because I like to have the cymbal close. Some people like to play more toms, and it can be 3, 4, even 5 toms. So the notation for this particular setup is the rack tom will be on the top space of the staff. And then the space below that is the snare drum, which we talked about before. And then the floor tom will be in the space just below the snare drum. So in between the bass drum, which is the bottom space, floor tom, snare drum, rack tom. If you have 2 rack toms, that second tom is going to be on the line just above the snare drum. So a good way to remember that is the toms that are up above the snare drum are also up above where the snare drum is in the staff. All right, we're going to play 4 notes on each drum, 4 eighth notes, and it'll be notated 4 notes on the snare drum, 4 eighth notes on the tom, 4 eighth notes on the snare drum, 4/8 notes on the floor tom. So we're going to play that whole sequence 4 times in a row. I'll count it off. Here we go. 1, 2, 1, 2, ready, go. When you're playing an exercise like this, it's important to stay super loose and relaxed, and also it helps if you have sort of a big range of motion because it helps to move from one drum to the other. And one other thing you might notice is that you need to move pretty quickly to get from the floor tom back over to the snare drum. We'll talk about some other ways to make that easier in a future lesson, but for now, just remember you need to move back in time to keep everything in time, so you sort of have to plan ahead for that a little bit with your motion. If you have more than 2 toms, you can go to the tom and back to the snare drum in between each one, or you can go all the way down your toms if you want. Any way you want to do it, just make sure you're staying in time and you're staying loose. Now we're going to add the feet to that exercise. We're just going to play quarter notes in the feet, and in both feet we're going to play heel down. So essentially, you're just tapping your toes. It looks and sounds like this. 1, 2, ready, go. If you play the left foot with your heel down, you have to make sure you have some pressure in it, because if you don't and you let it pop up right away, you're going to get this kind of a sound. Now let's play that exercise with the feet. One thing that you should pay attention to is to make sure your hands are even. With an exercise like this that's really downbeat driven, especially in the feet, you're going to have a tendency to want to have your right hand be a little heavier with that downbeat. So make sure your left hand is even with your right hand. Here we go. 1, 2, 1, 2, ready, go. Now remember, if you're having trouble with that and it's too fast, slow it down. Play it with a metronome, slow it way down to wherever it's comfortable for you, and you can stay even and relaxed and everything's right where it needs to be. In the next video, we're going to start using the toms in grooves, and we're going to add 16th notes to our snare drum and tom fills.